Hey guys, R Olson here, and welcome to episode 21 of the Science-Centric Podcast. If you haven't already done it, be sure to subscribe to the channel and hit that little bell to receive notifications when new content goes live. In this episode, we're delving into some controversial topics. In fact, I really couldn't think of more controversial topics than sex and gender and how the two relate to each other. Much like religion or politics, how we understand sex and gender are fundamental to how we operate in the world and inspire a whole range of opinions, often in conflict with each other. But in the last maybe 5 years or so, I've noticed some rather unusual ideas taking root. Number one is that distinct biological sexes don't exist. Sex categories like male and female are arbitrary and socially constructed, and sex exists on some kind of spectrum. Number two is that gender is completely divorced from biology, meaning that the gender you identify with and your outward expression of it aren't influenced by the sex you were born with. In my mind, denying these biological realities around sex and gender is to engage in a form of science denialism. Most troubling is that these ideas are finding a mainstream voice in scientists who also moonlight as gender activists, giving them a kind of scientific credibility. But unfortunately, denying science that's inconvenient to one's ideology makes it impossible to reach any kind of consensus on public policy issues. For example, thorny ones like transgender rights or gender disparities in certain career fields. Diving headfirst into these issues is our guest, Zach Elliott. Zach isn't a scientist or professional journalist, but rather an architecture student who sees himself as a kind of educator. Zach has written a short book on sex and gender called The Gender Paradox, and he has also started producing videos about these subjects for YouTube. I actually first became aware of him on Twitter, where I saw him debunking misinformation about intersex conditions, also known as DSDs, or disorders of sexual development. Zach and I spoke about how he got interested in this topic as a non-scientist, how intersex conditions are misused in discussions of transgender rights, and his step-by-step guide for writing an article that muddies the water around these controversial topics. But before we dive in, a quick reminder that we need your support to keep this podcast going. If you find value in interviews with leading scientists, journalists, and other thought leaders, consider becoming a member on Patreon. For a small monthly fee, members get benefits like early access to new episodes and their names mentioned in the show credits. Head over to sciencecentric.com/support for more info. Zach, I'll go ahead and formally welcome you to the podcast. Thanks for coming on. I've been following you on Twitter for, I don't know, maybe about a year or so, and just got interested in what you're doing. As I mentioned before we started, we were talking about sort of other guests I've had on. You're the first guest I've had on that isn't a scientist or sort of a working science journalist. I think what you're doing is kind of more in the realm of like citizen science almost. But maybe you could just, to start, tell us a little bit about the Paradox Institute, this sort of brand that you started, and how did you get into that?
Yeah, so I should just say, thanks for having me too. And I'm glad to be on here and talk about this stuff. So Paradox Institute really started in January, February 2020. And so it's an organization I formed to help educate people on the topics of sex and gender, and to do it in clear and concise animated videos that are really clean animation, easy to understand, and give people a visual too as they're listening to these topics. And it was really a response as well to a lot of the science denialism in our culture surrounding sex and sex differences, and also just reinforcing the importance of biology when it comes to things like sex and biological sex, and the differences between men and women on average, but also the similarities, and how the forces of biology and psychology and society form differences between individuals. So
But I mean, you're not a biology major. You're an architecture student
Architecture, yeah.
at Oklahoma State University. Um, how did you get interested in this topic as a
Yeah.
non-scientist? And by the way, I don't say that in a negative way. I think people can become interested in science, gain a lot of expertise over time. So I don't say that with any kind of as a put down at all.
Oh yeah, anybody can be interested in this stuff, and if they put the time into it and read and study things, they can really learn a lot and help people too. Uh, so yeah, I went into architecture. I love designing things, love being creative, and designing things that people can use. But I also around I've always been interested in psychology and biology as well. And around 2017, this explosion of science denialism really came onto the culture, especially on college campuses,
Yeah.
when it comes to sex and gender, particularly things like applied postmodernism and these critical theories like queer theory that says that sex is just a social construct, that these categories of male and female don't really exist, that they're fluid, that you can opt in and opt out at any moment. And so that really fascinated me. And I wanted to understand, like, where do these beliefs come from and what's wrong about them,
Yeah.
and what's true about some of them too, and like some of the grains of truth that they have. And so in 2017, I started looking at sex difference literature and research, and whether it be from biology or psychology, and I started to get really interested in that. And then also there was a memo that this guy named James Damore from Google wrote
Uh-huh.
about sex differences. And a lot of you can disagree with his prescriptions or what he concluded, uh, but he was presenting sex difference research about personality psychology, about endocrinology, and even aspects of sociology, and looking at how that might impact people's life choices in the careers that they go into
Mm-hmm.
on average. So I was interested in that too. And so I did research regarding the peer-reviewed papers that he presented. I read into them. I studied that as well. And so around 2017, around that time, after doing a lot of reading, I also wrote a literature review of sex differences, just the mainstream sex difference research, ranging from endocrinology to personality psychology to individual differences, understanding how those things might impact people's interests later in life.
Uh-huh.
And so that's really where it started and started to snowball.
Yeah.
And I found it fascinating.
Yeah.
I love synthesizing research together. I love writing. Uh, I had written 2 books before writing this literature review, just books about architecture and in my architecture school and studio. But then with this literature review that I wrote, it really started to get really interested in sex and gender. And then after 2017, I took sociology of gender in
Uh-huh.
2018,
A class.
and yeah, a
A
class,
college
a
course. Yeah.
college course, and that was really really interesting. It was really enlightening to see where this mainstream science denialism comes from in
Yeah.
part.
Yeah.
And sociology of gender taught us many important aspects about how gender, the behavioral expression of sex, is somewhat socially constructed and
Right.
defined by society, which it is to a certain degree. But what they really focused on at the beginning was sex itself, and how even sex is socially constructed, how even male and female are not reliable categories.
Uh-huh.
And they brought up things like intersex conditions and explained that the idea of sexual dimorphism is flawed. And so that really, really fascinated me too. Where does this come from? Why are they saying this kind of stuff? And so I saved all the presentations and the writing from that class too, and the peer-reviewed papers that they presented us from sociology. And then in 2019, I wrote a book called The Gender Paradox.
Mm-hmm.
And that was looking at how the forces of biology, psychology, and society
Hmm.
influence the differences and the similarities between men and women.
Yeah.
And
That's
the way
that's can I
yeah.
just jump in real quick? I mean,
Hmm.
a theme that really comes up on this podcast a lot is this concept of the biopsychosocial model of humans, where it's
Right.
like there's biological, psychological, and sociological factors that determine a lot of things. Um,
Right. Because if
but
you don't integrate all those together, you can't have a full
yes,
understanding of human behavior.
right.
Yeah.
So I feel like what's happening a lot right now, and what you're talking about is that there's people are very much focused on the sociological components, and saying that the biological components of what makes a human, how they are or how they behave in the world is not that important, and it's completely malleable, and it has connections to postmodernism and this sort of blank slatist ideology that that we're born as blank slates, and sociological factors completely determine everything about us. um,
Right.
I was first aware of this. I was watching a sort of debate with on TV. It's this Canadian show, The Agenda, with Steve something or other.
Yeah. Steve
And
Pinkin.
yeah,
I've seen clips of those. Yeah.
yeah, it was Jordan Peterson, who's sort of a controversial figure, but he was. Are you familiar with this?
Yeah, I
Yeah,
think so. I'm very familiar. Oh, wasn't it the were they debating the Ontario uh,
yeah,
C16?
Bill
Was that?
C-16,
Yeah.
which I don't want to get into, but
Yeah.
there was a historian of science on there
Mhm.
from a Canadian university. He was debating with Jordan Peterson, and I remember him, or it's I think a transgender man, but
Mhm.
I don't know how they identify, but was saying, well, sex is completely constructed. The biological
Right.
categories are completely constructed. This is maybe in like 2015, 16. And I was just, as a biologist, I was going, what? Like, this is insane.
Right.
Like, I,
Yeah.
why are you saying this? This makes no sense to me. And I thought, well, this is just a fringe idea. And then as time went on, I just saw that becoming more and more accepted into the mainstream, to the point where we now have, PhD students, and professors saying that biological sex
Oh
is
yeah.
a total social construction. I just blows my mind that idea has sort of spread, and I
Yeah,
just
and it's coming from all kinds of people. You do have PhD candidates and even biologists, and then you have lawyers, you have people that are elected to positions of in office like politicians, and uh, even there was a British member of Parliament, Don Butler, who said that babies are born without a sex and that we assign a sex to babies. And so it's like yeah, it's unbelievable.
I
It really is.
yeah. So my okay, so a couple of thoughts, and I want to see what you think about this, but um, I think that um, let's see how to get into this. I've been wanting to do a podcast episode on this for a while, but I've got so many
Hmm.
ideas in my head about this. But um, hold on, let me collect my thought here for a minute.
Hmm.
Um, so so there's this idea that came out of maybe second wave or third wave feminism, of this idea that sex and gender are different things. Sex is this physical, hard thing that you can't change, and then gender is something that you kind of choose, or gender roles are things that you can adopt or choose, and they're sort of societally constructed. I think there's truth in that. I mean, I think gender is the things that we associate with a particular sex. The gender roles and things have changed over time. Like, men used
Oh
to
yeah.
have
Hmm.
long hair, and that's become sort of associated as being more feminine. I mean, everybody had long hair. So,
Right.
or the kind
There's
of
definitely
yeah,
clothes. Yeah. Yeah,
clothing is
clothes. Like men
things or
used to wear high heels in the like 17th,
yeah,
century,
right.
and stuff like that. And this was
Yeah.
like supposed to exude masculinity was these
Yeah.
high heeled shoes.
Yeah, I mean
So yeah,
they wore things that would be now be considered so feminine.
hmm
And very frilly shirts and things. I mean, all that stuff can change. But they still
yeah,
would say, oh, okay, well, there's there's males and females, and there's a biological difference there. And I think what happened is it went from, okay, you can choose your sort of gender or your gender roles to, well, now you can just choose your sex as well. But
yeah.
there's like this hard biological reality that you can't overcome. And I feel like that's what we're seeing now. It's like this tension between people wanting to be able to make sex as malleable as gender, but gender is it's just not the same thing.
I saw a gender activist recently arguing on Twitter. I'm not sure who she was, but she had a doctorate. I believe it was in some type of sociology of gender, and she was talking about how the term sex is a social construct is perfectly valid, she said. And she was talking about how the meanings that we prescribe onto people's bodies is a social construct. She said that, and that is what sex is. We're prescribing meaning onto people's bodies, onto people's body parts. So why do we call a boy a boy? Why do we say that a boy will become a man? And so she's coming at it from completely sociological
Mm-hmm.
perspectives. But then, ironically, what she's also saying, she's really talking about gender in a way, prescribing meanings or social roles or expectations to people's bodies. Maybe I think what she's really getting at is gender. But there's this forwarding that they did in queer theory in the 90s, where they really took it a step further than the second wave feminists, where really now they're saying that, yeah, sex is a social construct too.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a more of a political and a social decision, as a lawyer from the ACLU said. And so I do think that gender and sex, they can't be completely separated, because there's
Uh-huh.
still a link there, especially when it comes to behavior and personality and interests. But it doesn't mean that gender is completely biological or completely sociological.
Mm-hmm.
Heather Heying has said before that gender is the behavioral expression of sex. And so that's defined by biology and culture. It's that intermingling of those
Mm.
two that define gender. And I think gender is really about, like, when we talk about behavior, it's really about averages. So like
Mm-hmm.
on average, men tend to have these interests or personality factors, and women on average tend to have this, but then there's a lot of overlap between the two.
Right.
And so we could say that, masculine would be a trait that is more common in males, but that women can also have. And then
Right.
feminine is a trait common in females that males can also exhibit.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, gender is definitely much more uh, malleable and can change over time, but then you have sex, which is really set in stone at conception and through in utero development. Uh, but you still have that linkage there between
Yeah.
sex and gender, which is important. Yeah.
It's kind of it's like a Venn diagram where there's sort of that
Yeah.
overlap, even though they're
Yeah.
sort of different concepts. And what's interesting too, if you read old papers in biology, they didn't make that distinction at all. And actually, still to this day, when they talk about like the gender of chimpanzees or something, they're talking about their sex. So this was sort of a construct of a feminist construct, which I think is fine. I mean, it is sort of
hmm
teasing apart that biopsychosocial components of things,
Yeah. I think
but
the
then it's
important thing
like,
about that
yeah,
analysis is that with gender and the feminist perspective, it is important to really tear apart regressive expectations and
mm-hmm,
regressive roles for the sexes, and that's a good goal to have. Uh, you can go too far when you put too much emphasis on the sociological component,
Yeah.
where you start denying mainstream science.
Right.
And when it comes to sex,
Right.
when it comes to just average sex differences that have been replicated,
Yeah.
just basic things. So, yeah, I think it's that balance between the sociological and the biological. But gender, definitely, there is an important component of defining it as the as expectations or aggressive roles. But then you also have more of the just personality and interests and that kind of things
Yeah.
that are not
Yeah.
regressive.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. There's that overlap with personality research. And the personality model has the most validation is that big five
Big five.
personality
Mm-hmm.
inventory. And again, on average, women have display certain traits on average more than men do. It doesn't mean that. So like agreeableness is one, right? And women tend to
Mm-hmm.
be on average more agreeable than men. On average, less emotionally stable than men. And so
Mm-hmm.
on the aggregate, actually, I'm not sure you know the psychologist Scott Barry Kaufman. He has a great article,
I
blog
don't think so.
post. Oh, okay. He had a great article, actually written on Scientific American, which I don't think he'd probably get published these days, but that looked at, well, these personality differences individually aren't that big, but when you take them all together, they have this sort of additive effect that being more
Right.
agreeable, being less sort of emotionally stable, these things kind of compound each other. And so we end up with
That's
these big behavioral
right.
differences. So
That's the really cool thing about multivariate analysis. And when it comes to personality psychology like that,
mm-hmm.
you can have these really close averages that like overlap a lot. But then, like let's say, agreeableness. Well, agreeableness, the overlap there is really large. And
Right.
it's about, I think, 60-40, that kind of thing. But on the extreme ends, where you get to the tail ends of the graph, that's where the largest differences really show themselves, is on that,
Yeah.
extreme agreeable or extreme disagreeable. And so you can simultaneously say that men and women share more commonalities and overlap there on the average, but
Mm-hmm.
then also that they're not at all alike on the extremes. And so you can have that's why the most disagreeable people in the world are almost all men, and the most agreeable people in the world are almost all women. But then
Right.
you have that average that really overlaps.
Yeah.
So that's the really cool thing that I discovered when I was writing about personality psychology, was
Yeah.
that overlap there and how that you can have your cake and eat it too.
Well, and
Yeah.
that's what got James Damore into trouble. And I feel like what happens in those debates is that there are people that I don't know if they're just ignorant of statistics, or they're sort of arguing in bad faith and they want to smear somebody, but they take that to mean that, well, you're talking about all women, or you're talking about all men, or you're prescribing something, when in fact you're just saying this is an observation based on good data, and we're not saying that you have to fit in the middle of the bell curve. You could be an outlier, and that's totally fine, but it
Right.
is okay to say that something is atypical, that it's not
Just on a statistical level.
on a
Yeah,
statistical level.
yeah.
And that's
It's
cool.
yeah.
Like, I totally support that. I love the diversity of
That's
people.
that's the cool thing about stuff
Yeah.
like this. Like when you really understand these statistics, you can really see that variation.
Yeah.
And it actually, I think, understanding those statistical differences and the variation between men and women and within men and women really shows you the diversity, and it also reduces the power that stereotypes have on people. Because when you understand that, an average doesn't mean that all people are like this,
No.
you can really see that full variation. And I think it gives us power to really deconstruct, in the good sense, like stereotypes,
Yeah.
and Yeah, I agree. Yeah.
And I can see the flip side of it too. I can see that people don't like that type of research because there are people that will take that research and use it to, justify saying, or use it in a way that suggests that all, like, you should be that way, or why are you so weird, or this is, you're
Right. Yeah.
abnormal. And
Right.
it's
They're
like,
prescribing a moral
yes,
framework onto
yeah,
the
yeah,
person instead of just accepting in a non-judgmental way
yeah.
what their atypical behavior is. They'll be like, yeah, this is the average and this is how it should be.
Yeah,
It's
and you're
yeah, it's
strange
totally
and
wrong.
fall in
Yeah.
line. And I don't think, at least that's not my, I think you have to separate what is from what ought to be. And people seem to have a trouble with that. They feel really, um, they feel fearful about people talking about what is, because then they're worried it's going to be taken as being prescriptive.
That's what I've noticed all the time when I'm talking about why there's only male and female sexes
Yeah.
and why we only have two and how that occurred and how it works in development. People will sometimes get the idea that I'm prescribing some moral view of the world of how it ought to be,
Yeah.
but not what actually is. But that's not. It's totally reverse of what's actually going on.
Yeah.
What is that there's two sexes, but then there's a range of expression and identity that people can have, and there's no. I'm not prescribing a moral framework at all. People should be able to live the life they choose as long as it doesn't infringe
Yeah.
on other people's rights. But it's important to recognize what is, especially when it comes to things like sex.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So you spend quite a bit of time on Twitter, I've noticed, sort of debunking debunking.
I'll get tagged in quite a bit too. People will tag me in and be like, Zach, can you help with this, or like check this out? And I'll often quote tweet, and I quote tweet. I don't usually get into arguments with people. What I'll
Mhm.
usually do is quote tweet the person to show my followers what they're saying, and I also want to show my followers what a response would be. And so when I do quote tweet people that I disagree with, it's usually not to convince them, but it's
Yeah.
rather to show my followers and show others, kind of both model the behavior that we want to see in a conversation, but also show the scientific response to that.
Uh-huh. Yeah.
Yeah.
So there's sort of been a trend that I've noticed. I think we alluded to this earlier, but there's these PhD students or professors even that will go on Twitter often, and they'll write these long threads saying, why sex is a spectrum. This is the idea that biologically these categories of male and female are ridiculous, and it's actually a spectrum, and there's all this stuff in between. You had an interesting tweet that you posted the other day. You said there's like 5 steps or something to this kind
yeah.
of thread. Do you remember what those are? Could you share that?
Yeah, I think the first, let's see, the first step, maybe I could pull it up. I can't remember it off the top of my head, but, oh yeah, okay, I got it. So, okay. So how to write a sex spectrum article in 5 easy steps. So the first one is you show that sex is more complicated than XX or XY. Second, you employ your intersex wildcard. 3, you list sex determination mechanisms in other animals. And 4, you conclude sex is on a spectrum. And then you argue that gender identity should replace sex in all aspects. And then bonus, you get to email Scientific American and get it published. So
So this is writing an article, not just a Twitter thread. Although those threads are kind of like mini articles. So
we could go through each point and
I think that would be
yeah.
interesting. Because I think this is where on Twitter these are the things that you're addressing as they come up. Okay, let's do that. I think that's a good framework to talk about sort of DSDs and things like that. Okay, so
right,
the first point is...
Okay, so point number 1. So number one, show that sex is more complicated than XX or XY. So here, activists will point to chromosomal anomalies, chromosomal variations, such as XO, XXY, XXX, XXXY, and they'll claim that sex is more complicated than just the XX or XY model. And the problem with that is we don't define sex through chromosomes alone. Chromosomes are simply the genetic instruction, which leads to sex development. And so if you change the instructions, if you maybe take the SRY gene that's on that Y chromosome and it translocates to an X chromosome in an XX fetus, that XX fetus with the SRY gene will develop as a male.
So just for the audience, so the SRY gene is the gene on the Y chromosome that kind of kicks off the cascade of things that need to happen for somebody to develop as a male, right?
Right.
Yeah.
And it kicks off a cascade, total cascade of genes. And
so if you move that to somewhere else, you can kind of artificially make that happen.
Right. And so that shows that it shows that we can still define male and female even in those cases. So the reason why we can define that XX fetus as a male is because they develop the phenotype or the reproductive anatomy that supports small gametes. And so the key to understand why activists use chromosomal anomalies is if you decouple sex from the reproductive anatomy and the function that reproductive anatomy serves in the first place, which is to support the production of small gametes or large gametes, then you can argue that there's more than two sexes by showing those chromosome variations. But the thing is, those chromosome variations still produce males or females because we define sex through that phenotype that you develop that relates to the gamete type.
Right. And so gametes, again, just for the audience, I try to keep this, try to break things down into plain language, but gametes is just a scientific term for eggs and sperm, essentially, that, and eggs are like huge compared to sperm, which are these tiny little things, and eggs have this huge amount of nutrients and things that are needed for development, and sperm are just basically DNA and like a little squiggly tail. I mean, that's how I think about it. I mean,
that's a good way to think about it. Yeah.
I mean, but I think that from a biological perspective, and also an evolutionary perspective, which I think is missing in a lot of these discussions, what defines male and female is the gametes. I mean, this is what you bring up a lot, I notice, when you're arguing or kind of conversing with these activists online. That is what defines male and female, right?
Right. It's the most objective way to define male and female because it's the one trait, like gamete type. That's the one trait that unifies or unites all sexually reproducing species.
Yeah.
There's a wide range of sex characteristics. Asparagus plants, they don't have, like male asparagus plants, they don't have penises like humans, it's totally different. But they still produce small gametes just like human males do. And the small gamete and so that's that unifying trait. And that's why it's the most objective definition of sex.
Right.
Is gamete type, and then how that gamete type correlates to the phenotype the organism develops. And that phenotype is that body morphology that supports those gametes.
Yeah. And I've looked into that a little bit. And I know I think we've both read a paper that sort of explains the origin of that, but it's so fundamental. I mean, there's no species that produce, there's no like multicellular organisms or species that produce gametes that are anything but that. There's always a big one and there's always a small one. And you really have to go down into through the evolutionary ladder to like these algae that maybe there's like a difference, they don't have that big difference. But anything that's multicellular is going to have have sexes. They're going to have one that makes large, group, or I don't know what you call that, phenotype that makes large gametes, and one that makes small gametes. And it's just like universal. So I think you're 100% correct on defining things that way. And then, what's interesting, I think is interesting, is that, we're very familiar with the XXXY system for getting sex ratios, meaning we're getting like a certain amount of egg producers and a certain amount of sperm producers. But then there's all these other species that have all these different mechanisms. So there's like the birds are different.
Birds are ZZ and ZW.
Yeah.
But the birds are like, the male will be ZZ. So they'll be I think it's called the homogametic instead of heterogametic sex, which is the one, that has the same chromosomes instead of two different chromosomes. In humans, the males have two different chromosomes, XY, and then the birds have XX or ZZ.
Yeah. And then you've got, I know this from working on nature programs, like, reptilian species, amphibian species, they do it by temperature, which is super weird. But so to say that, to say that sex is determined by chromosomes, that's the defining feature, seems a little strange to me, because it's just one mechanism by which you can get sex ratios. There's all these other mechanisms by which, and that's all that nature cares about. Nature, does not care how you got there. What it cares is what's the end ratio, because we need some of these large producers and some of these small producers. And actually, I have a video in the works about this, about how we ended up there. And I first actually became aware of it when I was writing an article in journalism school about sperm competition. And I remember seeing this book, and it was like saying, well, this is just a natural process by which we end up with it's happened probably multiple times in evolution that we end up with this like
like separate lineages. Both converge on that two gamete different size model.
Exactly. Yeah. So it's not like it's just a fundamental feature of maleness and femaleness. So like if we can't define it by these other characteristics, just doesn't work. So it's like you got to start there. That's like the ground floor, and then it's like, okay, now you can build up from there, right?
Right. So you can start there at the ground level of gamete type, and then understand how different mechanisms produce the sexes, right?
Yeah.
And I made a video back in February with Dr. Emma Hilton. She's a developmental biologist. Oh, cool. And we took a blog post that she made called From Humans to Asparagus, Females Are Females. And she took all these different animals across the animal kingdom, ranging from reptiles to bees to even mushrooms to asparagus, hyenas, and we looked at all the different sex determination mechanisms in the video. And after every single one, we concluded how we recognize the female of that species. And the common trait is that she develops a phenotype that supports large gametes every single time.
Right.
Even in asparagus plants, even in bees, reptiles, everything, same thing. And that shows you just how stable, evolutionarily stable, those two gametes are across species. Yeah,
it's a form. All right, well, we could get into that further. There's a great paper. I forget the author, but maybe I'll throw it in the show notes. But that explains sort of how we ended up there. I forget the guy's name.
I think there's.
Do you remember?
The one I share a lot is Jesse Lehtonen.
Yes, that's the one.
And Jeff Parker.
Yes.
Yeah. And I think Jeff Parker came up with a gamete competition model in the 70s.
Okay.
I believe.
Yeah, and these are guys. I mean, these guys have no bone to pick with sort of transgenderism or anything like that. I mean, they're like botanists or something. So they're really just looking at this from like a purely evolutionary standpoint. All right, so let's go down your list.
Yeah,
So
so
so that's
number
the first
two.
thing is confuse everybody by saying there's chromosomal differences. That's kind of
Right.
first first step. What's number two on that list?
Second step is employ the intersex wildcard.
Ah,
And so I'll unpack what intersex is and kind of understand why they're used that way. So intersex is an umbrella term for a variety of congenital conditions that affect the reproductive system of males and females. And there's like 40 plus of these conditions. Each one is unique, and each one has different rates in terms of the amount of percent of births that have these conditions.
uh-huh.
And so these affect reproductive development. You might have different chromosomes or atypical chromosomes for your sex. So let's say you might have XX and yet develop as a male, or you might have XY and develop as a female.
Mm-hmm.
You might have differences in hormone production. So there's examples where a fetus who is XY, they have a genetic mutation in the receptor that receives testosterone, and that like masculinizes the body. So with a mutation in that receptor gene, they can't respond to testosterone in the womb, and so they develop a complete female phenotype externally. And so these conditions often have really serious medical issues where you have to have lifelong medical treatment, take hormones. Most of them are infertile also.
Yeah.
And so activists will use intersex conditions because they want to show how the binary idea of sex is absurd. And they define the binary idea of sex as a male has to have XY, a penis, testicles, everything, and a female is always XX with ovaries, vagina, Mullerian structure. And so they set up this straw man where male and female are defined through these specific traits. And in reality, male and female, as we discussed, are defined through the phenotype they develop to support gametes. And so with intersex conditions, most intersex conditions are still clearly male or female.
Yeah.
But the activists rely on this mismatch of sex characteristics in these conditions to argue that sex is not binary.
Okay.
And
So somebody
yeah,
may have a mix of male and female traits or phenotypes, and so they're using that as an argument to say, well, there's sort of this spectrum of male and female, that these aren't legit categories.
right. They'll
Yeah.
look at variation of chromosomes, gonads, hormone production,
Yeah.
genital morphology, and they'll say that all these characteristics exist on a spectrum, and it can be on like dials in
Yeah.
every which way, and they can
Yeah.
mismatch. And
So when we're
yeah.
talking about percentages, I mean, I know these
Mm.
DSDs are very rare. Like, what percentage of births are people
Right.
that have this mismatch between, say, chromosomes and external, genitalia, or what do we?
So with that, really specifically with that genotype and phenotype mismatch, in cases of XY individuals developing as females or XX individuals developing as males, the percentage is around 0.02% of births.
0.02. Okay.
0.02%. And that means that 99.98% of births are clearly defined as male or female.
Yeah.
Now, you'll also see the stat with intersex conditions that says that they're 1.7%. And
Yes, I've seen that.
1.7, yeah, this 1.7 takes conditions that are developmental conditions just like intersex conditions, but conditions that are not as ambiguous, so to speak. They're more clearly defined as male or female. And also, they also take a condition called late onset congenital adrenal hyperplasia.
Okay.
And they take that condition. It's a mouthful. Yeah. They take that condition, and that condition develops after birth. And so that makes up 1.5%
Okay.
of the 1.7%.
Right.
And those individuals are always clearly male or female. And so what you notice is that these percentages, when it gets up to 1.7%, they provide this false idea that there's a lot more people that have this mismatch of genotype and phenotype than there really is.
Yeah.
And so that mismatch is only in the 0.02%, but not in the 1.7%.
Yeah. So I think that people with that condition, we'll call it LOCAH, they get some of these sort of hormonal problems. It's women, right? That are, phenotypically women, and then they get this late onset sort of condition where they maybe get like male pattern baldness and acne. I mean, it can vary in its severity, but
right.
And that's
usually doesn't affect males much.
Yeah.
It usually affects females the most.
I forget exactly how the hormone, but it's it's treat. I think it's fairly treatable. It's and that's the large majority of DSDs, or disorders of sexual development, or I think that's what the DSD stands for.
Disorders of sex development. You'll see differences in sex development. People have been using variations in sex development.
Oh, okay.
There's also,
I like that. Yeah.
I've used congenital conditions of sex development. I think it's pretty specific, so it kind of tells you that it's congenital, it's a medical condition, and it affects sex development. So there's definitely a wide range of terms, and people, I think a lot of them are perfectly valid to use too.
So I've seen that 1.7% figure, and then I noticed people round it up to 2%, and then they say, well, that's like as many people that have red hair or something, or some, and they're like, God, so that just shows that these intersex conditions, these DSDs, are so common that shows.
And it takes the seriousness away. Yeah, it takes the seriousness away from those conditions by saying that they're as common as red hair, and they're really serious medical conditions.
Yeah,
it's not a happy days necessarily with some of these medical conditions.
Right.
It's serious stuff, and so it really is unfortunate that they're used that way by activists.
And so so that's number 2. So bring in the intersex conditions, and then number 3 is.
So 3, list sex determination mechanisms in other animals.
Okay, and we talked about that a little bit. Yeah.
So that's kind of like a gambit to make people confused as to how we define sex. They'll be like, oh, there's all these different ways of determining sex in different animals, and they're not all the same, so I guess sex is just much more complicated than male or female. But the problem with that is that all these different sex determination mechanisms, as we talked about, still make males and females across all these species.
As defined by the gametes they produce, which are large or small, very large and very small. There's no overlap there. They're very different.
Overlap.
Okay, so we kind of talked about that, and so what's the 4th one?
And then 4 is conclude that sex is on a spectrum.
Okay.
So you conglomerate all that together. Sex is on a spectrum. And then 5 is you argue, and this is what I've seen a lot. I've seen this a lot too. So argue that gender identity should replace sex. So what you'll see happen such as the piece Sex Redefined in Nature, they'll present all these things, like show that sex is more complicated than XX or XY, talk about intersex conditions, talk about sex determination mechanisms in other animals. Then they'll say that because there's not one parameter that takes over every other parameter when it comes to sex, that gender identity should be the most reasonable parameter. And that's pretty much almost a direct quote from that article, Sex Redefined, at the end of that. And so what they're really doing is, it's really an ideological redefinition of sex that evolutionary biologists, that developmental biologists don't, it's not in the literature. I mean, you won't find this kind of stuff in the literature about redefining sex this way. And you'll see that ending across all these sex spectrum articles.
Yeah.
I just want to say that, of course, people can identify how they see fit.
Right.
And people also have the right to express themselves as long as it doesn't infringe on other people's rights. But there's still an important layer, a critical layer that sex has, both for individuals, like individuals' health and the health of society. And so you can't replace, in all instances, gender identity with sex. There has to be a resolution there that's not just a replacement.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
the idea is that they want to be allies to people that are, transgender, and so they're saying that because sex is a spectrum, this sort of bolsters this idea that gender also can be a spectrum. Is that the thrust of it? You're kind of saying the opposite, that they're trying to erase sex differences, but it seems like they're kind of trying to bolster transgenderism or something with sex spectrum.
Yeah. Sometimes the activists will take it from, they'll say that no, sex is real and defined, but my gender identity is woman or man. But then there's also these kind of articles where they'll replace gender identity with sex by saying that there's not a single trait that differentiates male from female. But there's all these differences that overlap, and it's so they say that the dividing line between male and female is arbitrary.
Yeah.
And they'll say because it's arbitrary, we should rely on people's internal sense of self to be the most logical parameter for somebody's sex.
Okay. Yeah. So this gets into the other issues, and maybe sort of the root of this, which is, what's happening in society is, there's a push for greater acceptance of people who are transgender, which is great. I mean, I think I'll speak. I don't want to speak for you, but we both support that idea. Like, I
do too.
Want to be more inclusive and have these people not feel excluded or ostracized. But it's also, there are some areas I feel that are, because of the biological reality of sex, that it's kind of impossible or really challenging to have people that identify as a particular gender enter that space. And the obvious one is sports, like women's sports, transgender males or trans women wanting to enter, female sports, because of other people have talked about this at length. But it's,
if you want to talk about that, I worked with Dr. Emma Hilton on a video that hasn't been released yet, but it was based on a paper a literature review that she wrote with a clinical physiologist. And I can kind of tell you about the data that they found, if you're interested in that.
I mean, I think it would be interesting to know why that is. I mean, is that what it addresses, sort of why that's a problem?
Yeah, it addresses the male sports performance advantage that's created from puberty and how that relates to sports, specifically when it comes to transgender women undergoing testosterone suppression. So taking hormones like estrogen and like reducing their testosterone and seeing how that affects sports performance.
Yeah.
And so what they did was, there's three parts to it. They first looked at the baseline biological differences between men and women when it comes to sports performance. So they looked at muscle strength parameters. They looked at the amount of oxygen you can utilize during intense exercise. They looked at bone length, bone density, tendon strength and force. And they took all these parameters from a lot of the mainstream literature around sex differences and physiology. And then the second part was taking those parameters, those baseline parameters, and looking at how that affects sports performance on average. So they looked at many sports ranging from cycling, track running, to weightlifting, even baseball, like throwing speed, hockey, things like that. And they found that the baseline advantage for males, just regular typical males and females that are in sports, the baseline was 10 to 50% advantage for males, depending on the sport.
Right.
And then, so they had that baseline there, 10 to 50%. And then they looked at 11 longitudinal studies of hundreds of transgender women undergoing testosterone suppression for about a year to 2 years to see how much that baseline sports performance advantage reduced over that period.
From just men versus women to biological men undergoing hormone therapy to suppress testosterone.
Right.
Seeing the effect. Yeah. Okay. This is interesting. It's got my
So
interest.
yeah, they took that, and then they compared these longitudinal studies and analyzed how much of that sports performance reduced with those biological males taking testosterone suppression. And what they found was that even with 1 to 2 years of testosterone suppression, the baseline performance advantage was only reduced by 2 to 12%. And the average was 5%. And so that means that these biological males that are taking testosterone suppression still retain about 20 to 30% of their advantage, depending on the sport. And so what they concluded was that because of that, the International Olympic Committee that maintains these guidelines for how you can get into the female sports category, they probably need to readjust their criteria based on this evidence. And the baseline for getting into, or the baseline for the International Olympic Committee that they set for testosterone was a certain, like a pretty small amount. They said it was 10 nanomoles per liter. And it's like pretty small, and they make you reduce that testosterone to that level. And so, yeah, those longitudinal studies used those testosterone levels, and it didn't reduce it enough.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The performance advantage.
That performance advantage.
From reducing the amount of testosterone available. Interesting. Okay.
So that shows that puberty has organizational effects on the body and on the muscles and on the bones.
Yeah.
Organizational meaning it builds the structures and it keeps them there. And so even if you take testosterone away, the structures are largely maintained.
Right. And so there'd be, strength advantages, upper body strength in particular.
Yes, very
all
much.
Those sorts
for
of
sure,
things.
Upper body.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I think my sense is that's where this science denial is sort of coming from, is that people want to allow transgender people to have the full lived experience that they want to have. And I totally sympathize with that. Like I don't want to deny people, but then it's like, well, it becomes it sort of infringes on female sports and people that want to have a fair contest. I was thinking about
there's a conflict of rights there. That's needs to be addressed very carefully and with a very much informed scientific perspective, for sure.
But I feel like the activist solution is just to say, the phrase we see is trans women are women, period. Like that's it. So they should be able to be in any space that they want, to compete in any arena that they want. And it's science denial. There's that case of that runner in Africa that was I forget her name, Samana.
Oh yeah, Caster Semenya, I think.
Caster Semenya, that has a DSD, I believe.
She has a DSD. Yeah.
She is actually chromosomally male, but has some kind of congenital disorder where she developed as a female, but still has like elevated testosterone levels. And when you see her, that she has very masculine characteristics, and so there's been a big debate around that, about whether that person should be allowed to compete in women's track and field in particular.
And that's where it gets even more complicated with specifically those kinds of DSDs. There's some DSDs that if you develop as an XY fetus and then you develop as a female, that it doesn't really affect sports performance at all.
Mm-hmm.
But then there's DSDs where an XY fetus can still fully respond to testosterone, but at birth they have this female phenotype or female body morphology. And so these are sometimes cases where it might be actually accurate to describe assigning a sex or observing their sex that's been observed incorrectly, technically. But there are, with Caster-Semenya, it gets really complicated because I don't think we have enough information about her DSD specifically. I'm pretty sure it's a DSD called 5ARD, but it's pretty complicated. But it's basically she can respond to testosterone still fully, and so that's where it gets really complicated with DSDs. And yeah, we need more information too.
Yeah.
So, and specifically how it relates to sports performance with those DSDs.
Yeah. So, okay, so let's see, we were talking about Caster-Semenya. That's a little bit of a diversion because it's such an odd case, but
it would take a while to get into it, but yeah, not for this time. Yeah.
But it's like it's become this sort of flashpoint. It's interesting how these flashpoints arise, and then you'll have, people sort of these trans activists sort of stack up on one side of it, and they throw around you're transphobic, you're whatever, and then the other side's like, well, no, you're denying science, and it just doesn't seem very productive.
Yeah.
But
it devolves. Yeah, quickly.
But when we first started talking, you said you're kind of trying not to argue with people. I think that's a wise that's a wise strategy, because I've been involved with online forums and things for a very long time, and it's like people become so entrenched in their positions and it's public and no one will concede anything, and it just, you go back and forth, and I've wasted so much time on Twitter, like arguing with people being like, no, you're wrong, and no, you're wrong. And it's just like, if people just sat down and had a conversation like we're having, you might actually get somewhere, but Twitter is just not the place for it.
It's so much better to talk in person about this kind of stuff.
Yeah. And it's complicated. I mean, that's like what makes it so interesting, right? Is it is so complicated. It affects all those things. It involves biology, psychology, sociology, probably, throw in economics and some, these other systems theory for all I know, like evolution. I mean,
it's
so fascinating.
It gets into philosophy too sometimes.
Philosophy. I mean, it's fascinating. I mean, I can understand the attraction to it, and that's why I'm interested in it as a former scientist. And but aside from correcting misinformation on Twitter, and you putting videos out on YouTube, what do you have in mind going forward with this Paradox Institute? Is it going to become an institute, or are you gonna develop it into something with more people, or where do you see this going for you personally?
So I definitely want to continue making videos really focused on sex and gender, really focused on both like the developmental biology and evolutionary biology of sex. But then, I think I started this to kind of form a common like an organization that's focused on a common topic and helping others learn about these kind of things. And so I think going forward, if it starts to get more attention, I think bringing on other people might help too, and collaborating more with others as well.
Yeah.
I've collaborated with Dr. Emma Hilton a few times, but just really collaborating with professionals in these areas would be great. So I could definitely see myself doing that in the future. Yeah.
Yeah, I think strategically that's a good idea. I when I worked for Scientific American, I had the benefit of working on videos with all of these amazing journalists who had such a deep knowledge of their subject areas, and it's really awesome. I mean, just to be able to tap that knowledge
Oh
rather
yeah,
than
yeah. I think
having to do all that primary research on your own.
right, right.
So that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, and building networks with people that share your interests. I love doing this, and I don't have huge long term like vision for the Paradox Institute, but definitely just keeping on building it. I'll keep making videos, and yeah, I'm probably collaborating with others in the future too.
Cool.
And yeah,
So one final question I'll ask you. So why is it called the Paradox Institute?
so it actually comes from the book, The Gender Paradox, that I wrote.
Huh.
And that gender paradox was really focusing on one, the contradictions within the postmodern activism, within queer theory, those contradictions that are very paradoxical. And then also the concept of the gender paradox in social sciences, the idea that the more egalitarian a country becomes, and the more equal, in a sense, the more opportunities for people, the wealthier, that people's differences on average grow larger. People are more able to express their interests and their personality without fear of social structures coming down on them and things like that. And so that's called the gender paradox, where men's and women's interests on average will grow larger. And so that was kind of a main thesis of that book. And then when I was looking for a name for the Paradox Institute, I wanted to have some type of name that communicates that it's an organization that has like a common purpose, that wants to educate people through a common purpose or common topic. And then adding on paradox was really combining those themes from the book and the paradox of this science denialism that we're seeing in our culture right now around sex and these contradictions. And so that's where it comes from. Yeah.
Cool. I like it.
Yep.
So where can people find you online? Where would you prefer that they find you? And
So
where can I get your book?
So you can find me on Twitter at ZAE Lefty with a Y. And then my books are on both Amazon.com and Lulu.com, Lulu.com. They're published from Lulu, so you can order them from Lulu or Amazon. Yeah. And Gender Paradox, yep.
And you've got your YouTube channel, of course.
And the YouTube channel. You can type Paradox Institute on YouTube and find it there. And under each video, we have peer-reviewed sources. Everything is sourced.
Yeah.
So that's important too. Yeah.
That's fantastic. Okay, great. Well, thanks so much for coming on. This has been like such a fascinating conversation. I learned some things. I hope the audience learns some things. And just thanks again. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Eric. Thanks for having me on.
Well, that's it for this episode. If you learned something new, be sure to smash the like and subscribe buttons. Also, click that little bell icon to get notifications when new episodes go live. If you don't do it, you won't get notified. I'd also love to hear your thoughts on this episode if you made it all the way to the end, so please leave a comment or question below. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.